Kathmandu, starting point for expeditions to climb Everest, is a 7,500-mile drive from Britain. Mick Hopkinson negotiated the narrow streets with an irreplaceable cargo, 11 handmade racing kayaks, and the only ones in Nepal. This was a unique expedition. 6 Olympic-class canoeists with some outstanding firsts in whitewater canoeing to their credit, including a 220-mile descent of the Blue Nile and the first shoot of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. They had come to Kathmandu not to climb the highest mountain in the world, but to descend the highest river in the world, the Dude Cozy. The British Everest canoe expedition had taken over 18 months to organise. It was led by Mike Jones, a 25-year-old doctor from Birmingham. Rob Hastings, the most stylish canoeist in the team, is a teacher. 22-year-old Dave Manby, the youngest of the 7 bachelors. Roger Heighton is a Yorkshireman from Bradford, as is Mick Hopkinson. At 28, the oldest and strongest of the party. John Liddell, despite being a chartered accountant, received the most love letters. But choosing John Gosling, a post office catering manager, to cook the food was pure genius. Climbing expeditions are commonplace in Kathmandu, and even the most modern clothes, tents and equipment are taken for granted. Why have these helmets got holes in them? To let the water out, of course. Who takes boats up a mountain? There's snow up there, and these paddles won't be much use. From Kathmandu, the trail leads due east, crossing range after range of foothills to meet the Dude Cozy after 80 miles. The source of the river is on the Khumbu Glacier, above the Everest base camp at an altitude of over 18,000 feet, the highest river in the world. It runs past the historic Taing Bochi Monastery, Namche Bazaar, the Sherpa's home village, and at Jubing has fallen over 13,000 feet in its first 50 miles. 50 miles later, it meets the Sun Cozy and becomes wide and peaceful as it flows down to the Bay of Bengal, 1,000 miles away. So the walk began. It's 130 miles to the source of the river, but everyone was aware as the path winds up ridges and down valleys that there was over 45,000 feet of uphill grind in front of them. The porters vary in age from 14 to 40 and carry loads weighing up to 60 pounds. For this, they're paid about £1 a day. The porters' union rated the canoe the same as a crevasse ladder, long and awkward, so an extra 25p a day was charged. It seemed a bargain. The day's walking started for everyone at 6 a.m. By 9 o'clock it was already warming up, and by 2 o'clock it was raining. One of the biggest risks for a canoeing expedition is to find no water in the river. Mike Jones' team weren't going to walk for 17 days just to find a dry riverbed, so they chose to do it in September at the height of the monsoon. As the rain fell, even the most pessimistic member accepted that there'd be more than enough water for all of them. Empty, the canoes weighed 30 pounds, but full of rainwater, they were unmovable. There was a limit to what the porters could carry, even for that extra 25p a day. Walking, camping, and living with 60 porters has certain benefits. They carry your equipment, and they cook your food. At first, this seemed a luxury, but as dysentery struck down one member after another, the advantage seemed dubious. Good weather cheers everyone up, and soon the scenery became more alpine. Tantalizing views of mountains were seen on the fine days. But they were still in the jungle, and the blood-sucking leeches fed well. As the day's walk came to an end, the tired legs became more hesitant and the load seemed more cumbersome. Everyone looked for the campfire smoke. For the porters, this meant delicious roast chickens, rice, dal and chapatis. For the Saabs, the best British dried food, delicately flavoured with fiberglass bonding resin that seemed to have pervaded everything. After a week, the expedition pleaded with the porters and ate their food for the rest of the trip. 8 days out from Kathmandu, they reached the Hillary Bridge and saw the Dood Cozy for the first time. Sherpas have a healthy dislike of water and a real fear of crossing the bridges, which are left unrepaired until they fall down, usually with someone on them. As if from the crocodile-infested lower reaches of the river, the iridescent canoe seemed reptilian, even to the inoffensive local lizard. At the top of each ridge, the mountains came into view, but these were only of minor interest to the canoeists. While mountaineers would look up for routes, the canoeists looked down, scrutinizing every foot of the river. Is there too much water? Will we be able to do it? Four days later, they reached Namche Bazaar, the Sherpas' home village. The expedition porters were Tamangs from the lower Sun Cozy Valley. Sherpas, the aristocrats of the Himalayas, preferred to carry for climbing expeditions, with tents, rope, and high-altitude clothing as their perks. But the Tamangs did their job, puzzled only by what they would do with a canoe if they were given one as a perk at the end of the trip. By now the team were getting acclimatized as they spent more time over 10,000 feet. They even began to take for granted 10-year-old girls acting as pack animals, carrying 50 pounds of wood. Taingboche Monastery is as sacred to climbers as to the monks themselves. Huddled beneath the highest peaks of the Himalayas, with its Buddhist monuments, it occupies a unique position in the long history of Everest. Early expeditions spent days there acclimatizing, as the Sherpas made the prayer wheel spin for a safe return. For the first time, the expedition saw Everest, remote and insignificant. That night, there was an air of anticlimax. But at dawn, mountains came into view that were uniquely Himalayan, cold, dominating, and dangerous. As the expedition got underway, higher, even more spectacular peaks crowded the skyline. But slowly Everest grew in scale, until there was no mistaking it, squat, huge, sitting firmly above the expedition's objective, the Khumbu Glacier. Once on the glacier, the canoes were easier to handle, but a swift gust of wind could really give the porter a nasty headache. Now they were in real climbing country, and Eric Jones, one of the two climbers with the expedition, took charge. The snows from Everest avalanche into the western Coombe and joined the giant Khumbu Glacier. In summer, this melts, and somewhere on its surface, the canoeists found a lake, the real source of the Dud Kosi. They had established a world's altitude record for canoeing, 17,500 feet. The great advantage of canoeing down a mountain is that once the head of the river has been reached, it's all downhill from there on. They knew there was to be nothing as easy as this for the rest of the descent, but even here, there were risks. At this altitude, a sudden violent movement provokes uncontrollable panting as the lungs gasp on the thin air, and a capsize would be very dangerous. The fiberglass canoes, just 4 meters long, were specially reinforced to resist the hammering from the rocks in the river and the sheer hydraulic force of the water. As it turned out, even strengthened, they just couldn't take the battering they were to get. Canoe design is a compromise between strength and weight. If, for example, these canoes had been made of steel, they would have been clumsy in a fast-moving river, and perhaps even more important, the porters wouldn't have been able to carry them. The ice lake gave the team some experience of high-altitude paddling. Under the south face of Lhotse, the magnificent satellite peak of Everest, the real river began. Dave Manby led the first part with Rob Hastings, who didn't like these shallow waters at all.
It was very frustrating for the first 3 days because it was so rocky and it was so steep. It was very difficult to actually paddle because there were so many rocks of all shapes and sizes littering the whole riverbed, and because there wasn't very much water in it, it was difficult to sort of actually get your paddle into the water.
Soon the river steepened, and the narrow gaps between the boulders forced the water into high-pressure jets. Breakout points were further apart, and the concentration required to avoid rocks intense. A rapid thrust of the paddle, a gasp for breath, moments loss of concentration, and Dave Manby capsizes. He tries to recover. Tries again. Tries a third time. It's his last chance. He's got to get out.
The boat came up and he capsized. I could see he tried to roll. The paddle came to the surface, but there just wasn't really very much space. His sort of paddle was trapped between the canoe and a rock. And the next thing I knew, he was swimming, so I immediately jumped out of my canoe. There's very little that you can do when somebody is swimming because of the strength of the current. Virtually the only thing you can do is position yourself strategically where he's most likely to be swept up, and jam yourself so you don't get pulled into the river as well. And the force of the water is incredible, and the last thing you want to do is to complicate the problem by swimming yourself. Unfortunately, I just positioned myself behind this rock and Dave got swept up onto it, and I just grabbed him, and he clambered out, and he avoided a very unpleasant experience. You can't survive a very long swing down a river. You lose your breath, and the next thing you know is that you just give up. But if you exhaust yourself while you're swimming, then you just get short of breath, you start taking water, you go underneath, you hit rocks, you're continually hitting rocks to continually go underwater.
Fortunately, Dave's injuries were minor, and now the party knew it was possible to survive a high-altitude capsize. But what would have happened if Rob hadn't been there to catch him and pull him out? The canoe was a complete write-off, and Dave gave it as a souvenir to the porters, solving by chance the problem of porter perks. It's now a chicken hutch at the Thai Bochi Monastery. Everest was still visible on the clear days, but as they descended, the river steepened again and became more serious. All the time, the canoeists are looking ahead for eddies where they can break out from the high-speed, lung-bursting dodging between boulders. The water was just above freezing, and survival time in it could be measured in minutes. Rob Hastings was in good form, taking a bold line down the river. By now, his confidence was high, but there were problems ahead even he couldn't anticipate.
The force of the water was quite extraordinary. I mean, I suddenly realised the rigidity in my boat just went, it sort of snapped like a bowstring or something like that. The canoe just folded up just behind the cockpit, just behind me, and I could feel it. The boat was sort of V-shaped, and immediately I realised that it was quite a potentially dangerous situation. I was in midstream, so I had 5 or 10 seconds to get to the bank, or I realised the boat would sink and I'd be swimming, and to swim down a river like that is the last thing you want to do.
Fortunately, Rob managed to repair his canoe while the team explored the river below. They were looking for suitable breakout points above impossible waterfalls and narrows, where the bank team could snatch a passing canoe before it swept over the fall. Ahead was the worst sluice they'd encountered so far, and there were only 2 possible eddies where Rob and Roger could stop. Rob misses the first one, shoots the fall, and makes the second. Roger Heighton wasn't so lucky. This was the nightmare that continuously haunted them. To be swept out of control for just 1 second too long, and end jammed irretrievably under a boulder. After 20 miles, the river fell into a steep-sided gorge. Jeff Tabner, one of the climbers, made a route down so the team could get a closer look to confirm that it was navigable. Already, they had broken 3 canoes, and at that rate, the remaining 8 canoes wouldn't see them through the next 79 miles to where the Dud Kosi meets the placid waters of the Sun Kosi. Access to the gorge was almost impossible, and the waters rushed along with undiminished force. An accident here would be unthinkable. It was a remote, savage place, where chockstones the size of several houses hung poised, ready to crash into the turbulent waters. Rob Hastings climbed back up, memorizing the route they were to take down the river. Left of that boulder, right to that eddy, avoid that log. Unconcerned by all this, Leo Dickinson, one of the cameramen, was determined to get into the perfect position where the jungle wouldn't screen his view. Mike Jones had suffered from the 3 most common Himalayan ailments: piles, dysentery, and snow blindness. They all made boating an unpleasant experience, but in fast, exciting water, they could easily be forgotten. The gorge ends where the Dudkosi is joined by the Butkosi, and suddenly the expedition began to feel the full force of the river. This was whitewater canoeing at its most difficult. In the Alps and Britain, the team had practiced on the steepest water, but the Dudkosi, falling at 270 feet per mile, was over 4 times as steep as anything they'd met before. One essential qualification for every member of the team was to be able to recover from a capsize by rolling his canoe on the first try, every time, and in the fastest water. There may be no time for a second attempt, and to lose the boat and try swimming in these conditions would be fatal. Apart from rocks, boils and whirlpools, the most formidable obstacle is a stoppaway, where the water turns over on itself and can seize a canoe or swimmer and churn him until smashed or drowned. The only way to break out is ploughing through it. This is impossible in a full-size life jacket, which makes them lethal. The team's jackets were just to give them some sort of buoyancy, but not enough to trap them if they were caught in a stopper. Rob Hastings was the first to take a bath in this sort of water.
I capsized on the first fall. I realised I'll be swept into the second fall before I had time to roll up, just because I hadn't got my paddle in my position. So I hung on upside down. And the next thing I knew was scraping rocks on my helmet.
It was here that training and practice counted. Disoriented, Rob recovered beautifully to negotiate the next fall. The Sherpa kids really enjoyed the whole show. Dave Manby, now fully recovered from his earlier swim, may lack elegance, but he makes it up with bags of nerve. This was real grade 6 water, the most difficult there is, where a capsize was a problem, but to lose the canoe would be a disaster. By now they were confident that they were masters of the river, and looking at the bottom was just a prelude to flipping up again. sort of water calls for strength, a finely developed sense of balance, and judgment to know when to pause for a rest. Above all, it requires a cool head when situations get out of control. Rob capsized right above a waterfall with no time to recover before he's over it. Rolls up completely lost and heading rapidly for another impossible situation. Capsizes. Rolls up again. It's exactly this sort of sequence that can lead to disaster, but Rob regains control. Mike Jones, stopped by the hydraulic back pressure of a stopper, had to use all his strength to break through it. This was the biggest fall they'd encountered, over 15 feet high, with a giant stopper at the bottom. Once caught in that, there was little chance of getting out. Mick Hopkinson psyched himself up to do it, and like a true expert, made it look easy. For the success and safety of the party, it was essential to operate as a team. They would follow each other through a section, then pull aside to make sure everyone was in good shape before tackling the next bit. Individual brilliance was important, but if things went wrong, good teamwork could avoid a disaster. After his virtuoso performance on the waterfall and 7 years without falling out of his canoe, Mick Hopkinson was full of confidence.
It was the end of a long day. We'd been on the go since 6 o'clock, canoed for probably 4 hours on some really difficult water. And at the end of the day, I made a mistake, a lapse of concentration. Capsized, swept sideways onto a large rock. Water pinned the canoe against the rock, and I was upside down in the water. And the water was going so fast, such was the force of it anyway, I couldn't get out of the canoe. I was being held against the rock by the water, perhaps for 40, 50 seconds. I had to sit up, I had to get out of the boat, I had to do something, and I kept trying and trying, and eventually I realised I wasn't going to do it. And at that point the boat actually bent, came off the rock, and I managed to get a breath.
Mike Jones had seen what had happened and reacted instantly. He shot downstream to get ahead of Mick, who made a frantic attempt to grab the end of his canoe. But these were desperate waters, and Mike had to look after his own survival. As the canoe slid over fall after fall, Mick, bowled over and over by the water, was swept out of sight down another channel. Mike Jones, still hindered by his snow blindness, managed to hold his canoe across the current, and Mick, completely exhausted, grabbed the stern. Shocked, battered, and confused, Mick Hopkinson was pulled onto the bank. Mike Jones had just performed a classical and extremely skillful canoe rescue on technically difficult waters. Mick was very lucky to be alive.
And I ended up swimming. I think swimming is the expression, but it actually just float. I was so exhausted I couldn't even try to swim for the bank. And at that point, Mike managed to get him back in his canoe and chased after me. But I thought that was it. I thought that was the end. Well, I should imagine drowning is very much like going to sleep. I was so physically exhausted from trying to get out of the canoe, from floating down the river, that I stopped caring. It's as simple as that. There's no panic. Panic involves a certain amount of adrenaline, a certain amount of energy. I just didn't have any energy left at all. I was just passing out altogether. That was it. helplessness is probably the worst thing. I popped out again and you take a breath and then back under the water. All this time you've been rolled along the bottom and you get your head cracked against rocks and things. And you think, this is it. Well, the water was flowing very fast. All you can hear is a crashing noise. I think probably when you get swept underneath for a long period of time and you get really frightened, there's very little you can do. It's the man in the water's job to try and get hold of the canoe. The canoeist can't do that much. Mike couldn't have done a great deal to, say, physically lift me onto the canoe at all, because the water was so difficult that he had to paddle down it himself. And once I actually, even though I got hold of the canoe, I had to let go of it because we dropped into a fairly big stopper, the two of us. If I'd held on to his canoe, then he'd have ended up swimming as well. So I actually let go once. But perhaps Mike's big problem was he didn't know exactly where to go down the rapid himself because he couldn't see. I actually opened my eyes and all I could see was a sort of brown, blue colour. And I was longing for the surface, to see the sky, if you like, and I couldn't. I was just completely and absolutely exhausted. So much so that just getting hold of the end of his boat was a major effort of willpower. And eventually, even when he pulled me near the bank, I just stared at the bank. You can appreciate that. I don't think a drowning man does clutch at straws. I just stared at the riverbank. I didn't have the energy to lift my arm to get hold of it. I was eventually pulled out by some of the porters. And the way I looked at it anyway was that having made a mistake like that, I'd never make another mistake. I'd never do the same stupid thing again. I'd never have the same lapse of concentration. I was that much more experienced than I was the day before.
By now, most of the canoes had been damaged by smashing against rocks in the river. Every night they were patched and reinforced, but 3 had already been written off. It seemed worth taking a risk to recover Mick's canoe, hoping it might be possible to repair it. Rob recovered it, and only now was it possible to see how Mick had managed to escape from under the boulder. His struggling under the water and the sheer force of the current had split the boat apart. As a special treat, Mick was given the last brand new boat being carried by the support party, with instructions to look after it this time. Each night they camped alongside the river, and the Sherpa cook boys did their best to make the fiberglass flavoured food taste interesting. There were no fresh eggs or chickens to be had. At dawn the air was frigid, and the icy water crashing past the tent door seemed very uninviting. It required a real effort of will to leave a warm sleeping bag, put on sodden wetsuit trousers, damp sweaters, to sit in a canoe with only 4 millimetres of fiberglass between your backside and the cold river. There was no warm-up period. 1 minute they were on the bank, the next hurtling down the river again. Just to show who was boss, the whole expedition, and Mick, breaking in his new canoe, shot the same rapids again. As Mick put it, after 18 months of planning and 10 weeks of getting there, you don't give up because you've fallen in. By now they'd been canoeing for 10 days and had descended over 10,000 feet from the start on the Kumbu Glacier Lake. Each section of the river was inspected before a descent was attempted. Here, all the water was swept under a jammed log. A mistake upstream, and the canoeist will be wedged in his canoe under the tree trunk. The team discussed its feasibility, not wanting a repetition of Mick's near-fatal swim. Finally, they took the chicken run, the easier, quiet water near the bank. With only a few canoes left serviceable, and some of those held together with sticky tape, they were taking no chances of failure, with success so near. The river was utterly relentless. Falls, haystack waves, rocks, and the ever-present thunder of rushing water. Mick and Mike take the next section of the river. Mick sees a huge stopper wave, but it's too late. He's swept into it, spun into a loop, and contemptuously spat out. Mike cunningly avoids it. At last, the end of the steep section was in sight. They'd travelled 50 miles and descended over 13,000 feet in the steepest and most continuously difficult water anyone on the expedition had experienced. There was an air of relief after conquering the most difficult section. And Dave Manby ducks into a victory road. But they were still only halfway down. They needed a halt to repair what canoes they could and to take stock of the food which was rapidly running out. No one would let go of his special handmade paddle, particularly as they cost £25 each. Writing off a canoe was one thing, but to a canoeist, his paddle represented the driving force behind the canoe, the steering mechanism, the brake, and the recovery device on a capsize. Losing a paddle in the Dudkosi is as serious to a canoeist as losing an ice axis to a climber on the summit of Everest. The tea quickly warmed them up, and they began to recall the incidents of the trip. Mike Jones' rescue of Mick, Rob's first roll hammering his head along the bottom, John Liddell still enjoying his stock of love letters, Dave Manby, the first one to take a big swim, luckily well caught by Rob Hastings. John Gosling still explaining the taste of fiberglass in the food and the missing stock of Dundee cakes. Roger Heighton, who made such a contribution high up, and with his smile keeping everybody's spirits high. With only 2 serviceable canoes left, the expedition still had 50 miles of the Dudkosi to complete. The 2 Mikes volunteered to try an alpine descent through the more placid lower reaches. They set out as the rest of the party started the long trek to Kathmandu. There would be no comforting support party on the bank to help the canoeists if they got into trouble. They carried the minimum of equipment and food, a sleeping bag each, a few bars of chocolate, and the expedition's last Dundee cake. 2 thoughts filled their minds as they paddled past mile after mile of paddy fields. Where would they be able to get some cooked food, even if it was only a few chapatis? And if the river really was infested with crocodiles, as the Sherpa said, where were they all hiding? They paddled for 50 miles round bend after bend, until each curve merged into the next as a solid green wall. It seemed endless. They had arranged to be met where the Dude Cozy meets the Sun Cozy. It seemed a vague arrangement, but right on schedule, the helicopter appeared, and the fear of the 5-day walk out to Kathmandu was eliminated. Their journey's end was really in sight. Elated with success, they paddled for the last time on the Dude Cozy. They'd no food left, and they'd seen no crocodiles. But the expedition had successfully completed the longest canoe descent in the world. For each of the team, it was a triumph. A burnt face and swollen lips were the last mementos of the high-altitude sun. The weight they had lost would be regained once they were eating normal food. But for them all, this had been the ultimate in canoeing adventures.